Hello everybody, today I am doing something very British. Though it looks nice and sunny out there, we are firmly in the grips of autumn, with winter just around the corner. It's 11 degrees, so it's not particularly biting, but neither is it warm. And here I am out driving a convertible, top down. But this is not just any old convertible, it's a TVR, a car knocked together in a shed by people called Bob and Ken in the darkest corner of Blackpool. A vehicle of rudimentary engineering with more power than it probably deserves and an attitude towards safety that was laissez-faire at best. So then James, why is it that on a day like this, in a fiberglass death trap, you've got such a big smile on your face? Well, the answer is simple, because I really couldn't think of anything better to be in. This is a TVR Chimaera, and today I'm going to tell you why even in conditions like this, it's perfect. A brief little history lesson for you all. The Chimaera was a product of what could be considered the golden age of TVR. It was introduced in 1992, following on from the 1990 introduction of the Griffith, with which it shares many major components, including the basic chassis structure and also the engine family. The idea behind the Chimaera was equal parts supplement to the Griffith, but also an entry-level point too. Whereas the Griff was best known for having its 5-litre engine, here most of them have something a little bit smaller. At various points in time, the Chimaera was available with engines displacing 4 litres. There was also a 4-litre high compression, a 4.3, a 4.5, and of course the same 5-litre as you got in the range-topping Griff. Like its brother, this was a convertible but with a Targa top panel, so you could have it either as I'm driving it now with the Targa panel removed, or in full convertible mode with this rear section down too, or as a sort of coupe with the roof panel in place. That, impressively, is actually a carbon fibre piece, though the method for getting it out is not very elegant. You have to click these little metal supports behind me to release the Targa panel, then grab it and stow it in the boot. Happily, unlike the Tuscan, where the roof panel sat on top of your stuff, and in the Timora, where it sits in the middle, this is stored in just about as logical a place as you could imagine. And one of the best things about TVRs of this era is that pretty much all of them have fairly generous storage space, making these an ideal car for longer trips away. In fact, everything about this car really epitomises what made the classic British Roadster so great. It has a reasonably lightweight construction. Here, steel tubular frames with a fiberglass body on top, for a total curb weight of some real-world 1,100 kilos. To give you some sense of scale, though this is a touch larger than the Griff, both are tiny, this is about the same size as a Mark III MX-5. It really isn't big at all. In all 4 corners, you have not just disc brakes, but also double wishbone suspension, and up front, that classic Rover V8, providing you that somewhat American soundtrack. It may not surprise you to hear that some TVRs did on occasion suffer a few reliability or build quality issues. Somehow, and I don't know how this happened, Bob and Ken weren't quite as effective at screwing stuff together as their Japanese counterparts. So today, finding a TVR that is all original is actually somewhat rare, and to be honest, I'm not convinced that desirable. This is no exception. I want to say a big thank you to Phil, who's brought this car out to me today, and John, his father, who it belongs to. A lovely pair of chaps who thoroughly believe in the healing power of the sports car. One of the reasons that it's not quite as clean as I know some of you would like is the fact that yesterday it spent all day long giving passenger rides to people as part of the Sporting Bears, a fabulous motoring charity that I'm proud to say I am a part of. And if you want to know a little bit more about what they do, just search Sporting Bears. They've had this car now for 7 years, having picked it up in 2015 when it was just about 20 years old. At that point in time, it had just 18,000 miles on the clock, and now, I'm very happy to say, it has 56,000. Wonderful stuff. Upon collection, they did have a few things done. Notably, some of the interior was retrimmed. Particularly problematic was this dash, which now is a lovely navy blue, matching the rest of the interior, but when bought was actually a cream colour, so reflected rather badly. The suspension was also past its best, so TVR owner favourite nitrons were installed. More recently, some larger brakes were fitted to the front, which involved new calipers, discs and pads. This, I'm told, was significant. To fit those, the car has also had to receive a new set of wheels. They look just like the Spider items as you'd see on something like a TVR Tuscan, but they're not. They are in fact bowlers, and I have to say, fit the car perfectly. The rear differential has also been upgraded to a later spec item. These are apparently just a bit more reliable than the earlier ones. Originally, these cars would have had 15 and 16-inch wheels on, but these are 17s. The reason being pretty simple. Trying to find decent sporty tyres in 15 or 16-inch widths can be very difficult. I must admit, I've always been somewhat confused as to why the Chimaera seems to live permanently in the shadow of the Griff. Yeah, sure, the Griff is well known for having the 5-litre engine, but you could get that here too. In theory, there were some differences between the two, but the ravages of time plus aftermarket upgrades will have all but eliminated those. I also happen to think that this is the prettier car. It has a more interesting, more classic shape. The Griffith was trying to be a little bit forward-thinking, and to be honest, the elegant shape that it had, with perhaps better construction techniques, might have worked, but I just don't think TVR had the precision to pull off something quite that simple. Inside, both cars are also pretty much the same. In other words, a feast of leather and old-school gauges. I rather like it. These seats are very plush, comfortable, don't really have much support, but then, like in a Caterham, as you're held in by the door and the rather large central tunnel, it's not actually much of an issue anyway. From factory, the dash here would have had a wooden veneer. However, they have a tendency to crack, and that's exactly what had happened to this. So, to replace it, they've installed this very popular aluminium item that I think looks miles better. Over the car's life, a number of changes were made. The engine range varied from year to year, and also halfway through the lineup, the gearbox was changed too. This, being a slightly later one, has the familiar Borg Warner T5, as in just about every other TVR I've ever experienced. It is actually a very nice box, and in fact, this leads me on to really the main point that I want to make. These cars have a pretty awful reputation, not just in terms of build quality, but also in the way that they handle. However, I think that's actually one of the best things about them. This particular example doesn't even have power steering. Even those fitted with it are wonderfully communicative cars. The suspension, once properly set up, also gives you plenty of feel, feedback and interaction. No, it's not the fastest thing across ground, but it gives you some real, proper, old-school mechanical interaction that makes you feel like an absolute hero. You seem to be sat more or less on the floor, though it is a tiny car. It seems like the dash is way up here, and it's just wondrous. Seeing it go down the road this morning, it looked the absolute business. So, time for me to try what it's like from this seat. Like most TVRs, there isn't a really obvious way to tell what the red line is supposed to be, but with this engine, come about 5,000 RPM, it really feels like you probably should be shifting. It's not the quickest thing in the world. The rumour was that TVR's power outputs were always optimistic at best. Officially, this is 240 horses, with some 277 pound-foot of torque, but it doesn't matter. Not one bit, because this car feels fantastic. If anything, by having the slightly lower power engine, I'm more brave to put my foot all the way down. This car has no driver aids, as was the TVR way, no traction control, certainly no stability control, not even ABS. There's also no airbags, so you're constantly wary of what might happen if things were to go wrong. But still, it's glorious. The feel from the wheel, absolutely sensational. The view out the front, brilliant. You feel like you're piloting something really big, proper and massive, but actually it's an optical illusion. It's not that big at all. It's perfectly sized for this kind of road. You look down and think you're doing 90 when actually you're just doing 60. And that's fabulous. But other things surprise you too. The doors actually work. This older one has a button at the back, later ones had the button under the wing mirror, which many TVRs are best known for having. The interior also has the beginnings of some of the bonkers stuff the firm were to become famous for. So to get out of this car, you twist this little dial here that I keep thinking is a brake bias valve, but it's not. It'll open the door. Be worried about kids in this thing, I'll tell you that. Heel and toe is really quite nice. All of the pedals in here are quite soft by comparison to some of the later cars, particularly the Tuscan. In that, everything was just a little bit firmer, all the controls a little bit weightier, with the exception really of the steering. For a, by European standards, fairly large displacement V8, it doesn't feel especially torquey, but in comparison to, say, many other British roadsters with a little four-cylinder, it has ample poke. And let's be honest, with a car like this, I think in many cases, the noise it makes is far more important than the way that it goes. The brakes are responsive enough, and happily, on a day like today, where though it's cold, it is still dry, they haven't challenged the tyres at all. The lack of ABS, not a problem here. I didn't have a particularly effective morning, I must admit. I was a little bit lost because, first off, the sun wasn't at all where I wanted it to be. It's the middle of October. For us to have blue skies is not exactly something I expect. I also then found out that my microphone had run out of battery, which was very inconvenient. Fortunately, I carry a spare, but I was running around like a headless chicken for a good 25 minutes. And yet, 5 minutes in this, and I am once again calm, relaxed, a picture of serenity. And that's not really what you'd expect from a TVR, is it? But it'll do that. Now, I know what you're thinking. James, it's all well and good, smiles and loveliness, until it breaks down and strands you on the side of the road. But in the 7 years and near 40,000 miles that this car's owners have done in it, it's only let them down once, and that was conveniently at home when it was on the driveway. It blew off an oil hose, so they simply never started the journey. Beyond that, it's been absolutely fine. Even better, in comparison to the later TVRs, these are much cheaper to keep going. That Rover V8 really isn't particularly complicated. It's fairly robust, particularly in its lower states of tune as it is here. Many of the other parts on this car have also been pinched from various places. Originally, the indicator stalks were from a Vauxhall, as you'd see in the Lotus Elise. Now they've got the slightly later and funkier metal items. But this is all good news because it means all of these parts generally are quite cheap. They're easy to get a hold of. The TVR community is also absolutely fantastic. Not only do they have a brilliant owners club with a wonderful magazine, Sprint, hello to Sprint readers because I know I've appeared in it a couple of times, the passion and the dedication from the people that help keep these cars on the road is admirable. You buy a TVR and it comes with the greatest optional extra of them all, some friends. TVR owners also like to use their cars, and I'm told by those who do use them frequently, that also makes them a little bit better behaved. They love taking these things on road trips, going all over the place. Open up a copy of Seb magazine and you'll find all sorts of different places you can take your TVR. What a wonderful thing to do. And even better than that, these, for some reason, still are not that expensive. A Tuscan once upon a time could be had for something in the teens, but now really for a good one you're talking about 25 or 30 grand. However, the Griffith and Chimaera have failed to appreciate in the same way that stuff like the Cigaris, Tuscan and the Cerbera have. I recently drove a Cerbera, and my real big problem with it is that though that is a fabulous car, sensational to drive, I think even better than this, and with its manic TVR designed V8 that this was supposed to get but never did, that's a whole separate story, I do kind of want the open air experience, because then the fact it isn't particularly fast or the world's most dynamic thing doesn't matter. But actually calling it not the world's most dynamic thing is probably doing it a disservice. In terms of feel, feedback, torque and texture, this is one of the best cars you'll ever drive. The pedals, inferior, yes, to the Tuscan. I prefer the way that car does things, but the way this is set up kind of suits the character of it. It's more relaxed, it's less focused, and that I think is a good thing, because in the Tuscan, the way it's set up, the way it makes you feel, is like it's a car that's pin sharp. and I think you'll very quickly discover that actually it will come undone fairly quickly. This doesn't make you feel that way about it. This reminds you at all times it is still a somewhat old school car, and so you drive it as such. I suppose in very many ways this really is the ultimate evolution of the classic British sports car. If you've always lusted after something like an old Lotus Elan but you think it's just too small, too impractical, or maybe too valuable to buy now, this is the car for you. It drives modern enough and has enough pace that you can really enjoy it and it will excite. It also makes a fabulous noise. I mean, if you're going to buy a TVR, it has to make a good sound. And this is judged just about perfectly. This particular car, by the way, has the sports exhaust option fitted. When I inquired what exactly that means, I was told the same thing as John was told when he asked the TVR dealer. Essentially, they take off the standard exhaust, get the secondary cat, gut it, and then put the exhaust back on. Hey presto, TVR sports exhaust. Gotta love that company, right? TVR's boss Peter Wheeler was a particularly tall man, so larger individuals can also buy one of these, safe in the knowledge they're likely going to fit. There is no air conditioning in here, that was optional and this car doesn't have it, but to be fair, it doesn't really tend to work all that well in cars that do. What does work conveniently is the heater, but even so, you may have noticed I forgot to put a jacket on, and I thought that was going to be something I would soon regret. But I don't. In fact, the heater isn't even turned up that high, it's on sort of tick over, but because of the way this thing is shaped, you get very little in the way of buffeting here. Gripes? Yes, of course, I have some. It's making a very worrying metallic noise from the suspension, which is thus far unidentified. The owners know about it, but they just haven't discovered what it is. At some point, one of these, I suppose, could let you down, but chances are it's going to be something quite silly. This is one of the other things that I like about these. The later Speed 6 engine cars do have a reputation for fragility. There's not really anything you can do about that. It's a constant concern, and if and when they do break, it's very, very expensive. Here though, that old Rover V8 will likely just keep chugging along. The big issue which historically affected them was the chassis. As these are tubular steel with a fiberglass body, rust often was quite well hidden. The outriggers of the chassis in particular were known to go, and it isn't at all unheard of for one of these cars to have had a whole new chassis. That is quite a big job. However, happily, where 10 years ago a number of these were out there with some serious problems lurking below, nowadays it's not really much of a concern, because simply put, the cars that 10 years ago were bad either have melted back into the earth or now have been fixed. The other thing that you'll find is a car like this which has simply been well cared for from day one, and in which case you've really no need to worry about buying a TVR Chimaera. And I've left the best bit till last. I told you these haven't really appreciated in the same way as many other Trevors. That's true. What would you pay to get yourself into one of these? Well, a pretty ropey example, £10,000, but the very best of the bunch, only about 20. About a month ago, I drove a Maserati Spider, which really on the face of it should have been one of these cars, but done right. A proper chassis made by a company that does sometimes know what they're doing, with a Ferrari V8 up the front, and those command quite a bit more money than these. But it turned out to be one of the most disappointing experiences of my motoring journalism career. That car was so bad in terms of scuttle shake, it was pretty much unusable. This, by comparison, has, well, just about none. It also has bags of character, and let's be honest here, it is going to be a lot cheaper to keep going than just about any Maserati. So it turns out that the Chimaera, a car which came out in the early 1990s, is actually better to drive, more enjoyable, and has a nearly as good soundtrack as the Maserati Spider. That costs more when new, more now, and is about 10 years younger. And TVR don't have a particularly good reputation. You know, from in here, while this is all working wonderful and lovely, it's kind of hard to work out why that is. My my S2000 has been away for quite a while now. In fact, I haven't seen it for over a year. It's in many different pieces, with the engine currently in a container off to be rebuilt. It's very likely that I'm not going to see that car until next year. And if it weren't for the fact that we're now heading into the depths of winter, I'm pretty convinced I would currently be on the hunt for a TVR Chimaera. The only struggle I would have is that I really would quite like one in British Racing Green with a biscuit interior. But I tell everybody that will listen not to buy a car like that in British Racing Green because you become invisible to other road users. I love this car. I really, really love it. Anyway, a massive thank you to Phil for bringing this out, to John for allowing him to do so, and for having such great taste in cars, which evidently runs in the family. Apparently, an uncle once had one of these as a company car. How times have changed. And of course, a huge thanks to all of you for watching. As ever, don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you for the next one. Bye bye!